So I'm all keen to listen about the entrepreneurship journey of Tomasz. So when we first started thinking about this webinar series, I was following Tomasz on LinkedIn and I approached him. So what I learned is ABC, for which Tomasz is the CTO, is not his first, but his third robotic startup. So which is quite exciting. So, and also apart from being in his third startup, Tomasz also is in advisory roles and various other roles, helping lots of startup companies within the robotics, and he keeps in touch with the robotic startup ecosystem globally and follows it quite closely. So I would rather not waste much time in talking about him and pass it on to him to share his journey in robotics entrepreneurship. Off to you, Tomasz.
Thank you, Radhika. Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank you, Radhika and other organizers of this series for invitation, and a really professional organization. Yeah, so yeah, I'll just start and kick off this 20-minute presentation. So my name is Tomasz Wierzchowski, and today I'll be speaking more about my journey, less maybe about the projects specifically I worked on in past. Yeah, the title of this presentation I gave like as an inspirational startup stories across industrial inspection drones, consumer and agriculture. Right. So I'll really divide this into 4 parts. So I'll do a quick intro about myself, per my career and path. Then I'll be going through the entrepreneurship journey for robotics. To be talking about 3 to 4 projects there. And I will have one quick slide about some highlights of some very arbitrarily chosen, not sure if advices, but lessons learned. And then I think the most important part of this presentation is Q&A, which I think should take 15 minutes, 20 minutes, or even more at the end, guided by Radhika or by participants as well. Yeah, so without any further ado, I'll start. So where do I came from? So I'm Polish born, educated. I've done my master's in engineering at Silesian University of Technology in robotics and control engineering back in 2010. I also done postgraduate studies at Cranfield University in UK, which some of you might heard of from their really impressive aerospace, defense, and automotive background. I was doing their second year cohort autonomous vehicle dynamics and control course, which was quite actually interesting and quite unique, I think, till today. When Radhika mentioned that I'm involved in like startup ecosystem and advisory roles, I'm actually also an advisory board member at Cranfield University for their new MSc in robotics and also the AVDC course. And throughout my career, I had, I think, quite interesting path, which I'll be talking about today, which goes in between startups and corporates in mobile robotics, within different European and like Asian countries as well. So I will not be going into details here now. It's just like a quick outlay of the roles I had in past, which I'll be speaking about today. So some graphical highlights of projects I worked on. So I worked on industrial drones in Dutch startup Ariatronics, which I have separate part of this presentation. I also worked outside of startups in mobile robotics, specifically at Dyson, which some of you might know from the robotics experience as well, which not maybe very well known globally, but within robotics communities, you might hear more and more about Dyson, especially with their Imperial College London robotics lab led by Professor Davidson, who's one of the pioneers of visual SLAM technologies. Another example of projects I worked on is a social robotics startup called 𝐀𝐠𝐞𝐧𝐝𝐚, based in London. Right, so I'll start with the story. So a few examples. I will not go into details. I will just like maybe play some video in background. I will talk about a few interesting highlights. It's definitely not like a technical presentation going into details. We can go into details as part of the QA later. So the first chapter of the story is starts in Netherlands, in beautiful city of The Hague, actually in the Scheveningen district, which is next to the sea, and that's where I started my entrepreneurship journey in robotics. I joined a startup called Ariatronics. It was back 2012. And the startup was working on commercial drones for various applications. I joined as an first in-house engineer employed. The company worked before with some contractors, with some freelancers. I was the first full-time employee on engineering department. And this is quite interesting from multiple reasons. So first of all, it was a startup, robotic startup, that makes things, I would say, quite interesting, like with any startup, specifically robotic startups, because of the complexity of the projects and novelty normally required and of skill sets within the team. You can learn quite a lot, I would say. Second of all, why it was interesting, this specific project and company is timing. So back in 2012, not many people heard about drones, specifically not commercial drones, well, and definitely not consumer drones. And just to give you one quick benchmark, in 2012, DJI, so this is now the leader of consumer and prosumer drones, which definitely every one of you heard at least of, if not worked with some of the systems. Didn't yet released Phantom, which was their first and kind of pretty much the first consumer ready-to-fly drone, which now is quite mainstream. Like 2012, it was pre-Phantom era in terms of drones in general. What does it mean? That means that when it comes to developing, especially the hardware of these drones and supplier ecosystem, it doesn't exist yet. So it was quite interesting to work and lead the project where you have to develop many components from bespoke components from scratch, even for low volume manufacturing sales. It also comes with the one of the most critical component of a drone system, unmanned aircraft system, which is the avionics or flight control systems, which is different topic in itself, how you approach this in robotics projects, because it's a bit different in terms of requirements compared to ground robots, especially slow moving ground robots. But I'll just play in the background here as I speak, because I'll forget some highlights of the project, so you can see what type of systems were developed actually. And what else I can mention here? So the platforms we worked on were multi-rotor, a family of multi-rotor drones for primarily industrial inspection and surveillance, but in commercial applications mostly. Industrial inspection was actually the most promising market after 2 years of business development. That's where the company kind of honed on in terms of business side. And that's where the product started to be optimized for. That's where the payloads which were developed, like you can see in the video below, with partnership with NVIDIA. And they then newly announced Jetson system on modules, GPU families, mobile GPU family was focused. I'll speak about maybe later for the Q&A sessions about details of the project, but the company pretty much grew from few employees to around 20, 30, and we acquired a supplier, which was avionics company, a consultancy on the way. So definitely quite a journey, and definitely a place where you have to learn from I would say, from comparable fields, transferable domains, because sometimes you work on a project where commercial projects where there's not enough know-how in the industry because you're developing one of the first products together with your competitors or in things that happen in academia. But you cannot like take someone who done it before. And this is definitely something I would recommend people to do, even before founding their first business, to work on projects where they have to push their limits. Yeah. Okay. So this is the first part of the journey. Now I'll jump over to my next robotics experience startup where I was part of. So the next business was based in London, and it was an business called Emotech, which was a bit later stage when it comes to financing of so Series A stage robotics AI startup, which was developing a personal robot with evolving personality. So you might heard of this project. The product which we developed at that time was called Ollie. It was a personal assistant, but very different to like voice assistants like Alexa or Google Home, in the sense that it was an assistant which had something which we called evolving personality. And was also physical in means that it was animated physically. So it could not move, it couldn't move in the room, but it was actually, I'll play video here. It was moving around, let's say. It was animated. And we're developing quite a lot of in-house technologies in-house, including natural language processing, automatic speaker recognition, also speech engines and character engines, which is something which is on the kind of boundary of robotics and human interaction topic. And it was also a consumer device, so it's something which hardware and software has to be designed to scale and to work for every customer in a way that he's satisfied or she. And this was a very different experience from B2B startup. So the Ariatronics, the drone company, was a company which was working in business-to-business model sales. So it was enterprise sales, where it's low volumes, you customize sometimes to some users. Here we are in consumer electronics space. So very different type of startup and type of robotics projects, because you develop one project, you send it to production, of course, simplifying it, and it should work for every user at scale. So, volumes, we're talking here about hundreds of thousands of units per year that production was aimed at, and then customers. And also the bill of materials, cost of goods sold, very different ball game. The company, when I joined them, some insights was, I think, around 10, maybe 12, with around 7 engineering team. We grew to around 15, I think, that's working there. And without going into too much insights, the focus was on industrialization of the prototypes, and obviously on the hardware side, working with contract manufacturers in Asia, but also to further developing the computer vision and the character engine and the language processing capabilities of the product. Right. Next step of the journey is something different. It's not directly startup. It is something which I experimented with more full-time than till today, more part-time, is actually advisory and consulting development services. So I set up my own, say, consultancy business called Innovation Squadron, where I still try to leverage my experience to different type of robotics and robotics-related technologies projects for mostly startup scale-ups, but sometimes also corporate customers. And a few examples of projects I had the pleasure to work with. I worked with a studio called Blotto Studio. This is a non-robotics business, but they wanted to use an robotics technology for some of the product, which I cannot talk about much. I can just play a video. It was a kind of scanner to generate very detailed models of textures of some materials. Very, very niche application, and the scanner had to be quite interestingly optimized. I also worked for a while as an interim CTO, consultant CTO for a business called Oculo, and this is non-robotics business, but using computer vision and visual SLAM technology, working in construction technology, using 360 cameras mounted on the helmets, which passively collect walks of around construction site and building a virtual map and type of street view equivalent of a construction site on daily basis or weekly basis, mapping it to floor plans. So this is quite interesting example of non-robotics technology, because actually from business perspective and technology perspective, non-robot could do the job of human walking around unstructured construction site, opening doors and so on, at the cost that it will be competitive to sell the services. So this is quite interesting project of non-robotics robotics technologies applied. This was interesting experience to see how it works if you're advising companies, and when it can work, when it wouldn't work, and what are the trade-offs. This is an interesting path out, I think, probably at the later stage of your career, when you have enough experience to actually contribute significantly as independent external person to the businesses. And last bit is something which is the most recent project I'm involved in. So this is a company called HeyVC. This is a British company where it's working. This is an application of robotics in agriculture, and the business is developing a hopping robot to provide intensive scouting of crops at metrics that none other platform could do. I will not go into the kind of agronomy agriculture lecture today, because we spent like another 2 hours. But the main point of the project, or like the challenges and the unique selling points of this platform is it's hopping versus flying or driving or walking even. And hopping gives exactly an coverage and mobility that is required, and the frequency of scanning at the micro level is actually critical to detect problems in field, like early stage weeds, like very, very micro bugs, which are smaller than millimeter at scale. So we're talking about hundreds of hectares of fields, which need to be scanned every 2 days. And if you actually look into the problem more precisely, none other platform, so walking or driving or flying, could do that at scale. So this is where the company actually developed and patented an hopping robot. This is very, very, I would say, breakthrough project and very long term. It's also very challenging to develop a new type of locomotion robot. As you might know, actually there's no successful hopping robots developed, definitely not the ones at that type of scale. And the company is actually quite long journey so far. It was founded in 2016. The first funding happened in 2018, beginning around 610,000 British pounds from angels and grants. With this money, we created proof of concept, both for the robotics vehicle, but also for weed detection, computer vision models, business model creation, some trials done, and very extensive team building, senior engineers, and fundraising, which is still moving forward for our next round. The very interesting insights here. So the role which I have with this business is Chief Technology Officer. So I'm responsible for all of the engineering and manufacturing and research activities and teams. And actually, the interesting challenge when you see here is more specific to business and the investment market than to technology. Because for technology, if you have senior enough team and a good plan, you definitely can deliver a product, but you do need to have significant budgets, which comes from either investor or grants or a combination of these. And this is interesting insights. And nowadays, to get a proper size investment for scaling, let's say, prototype stage of quite of hardware-based business become quite challenging due to rapid rise of software as a service startups. So just to give you one example, only 70% of the, let's say, venture capital funds do only software, enterprise software. So then you have 30, which might consider 30% globally, might consider hardware. And when we say hardware, it will be not hardware like robotics, but hardware as a sensor or like a small device actuator. So, and agriculture is quite actually, agri-tech in general is quite new in startup world. So fundraising is very interesting and challenging when you look into, and let's say very, when we were one of the first companies breaking the field pretty much. So this is another angle here, technology, which is fantastic application and so on, but in the end, you need to have finance, you have to have budgets to work with in order to not just deliver prototype, but to actually go to market and to have significant traction as well, business traction. Yeah, so I'll probably leave this for later. I'll play a video of how this device works as well. This is early prototypes. That's what I can share publicly. So it's hopping around 6 meters, 6 to 10 meters forward very quickly. It lands, it scans statically, quite large patch of field, and then scans again, and jumps again, scans again. Again, it's just to give you a flavor of complexity here when it comes to the locomotion mode. Yeah, and some lessons learned. This is not like arbitrary actually, of working in startups for mobile robotics. Well, what's different compared to corporate, for example, or larger teams? So yeah, you have smaller and more interdisciplinary teams. So does mean that you definitely have more impact and influence on the product. Even if you're not a founder or CTO of the business. So this is one, I would say, quite big difference and opportunity. You also tend to have higher dynamics of work, of teams when it comes to requirements, product, business scope, which might be on one side interesting, but for some it might be, they might find it difficult because things can change from business perspective. For example, we find out that this application of product requires change and it might have dramatic consequences to requirements. So this is something which kind of requires good management also, but also being prepared for. Another thing is that there's need to be more efficient with people, processes, tools, which is, of course, it's kind of manageable at small scale when you have like 10 people or 20 people in your team. But definitely mindset is different than has to be different than corporate bigger teams in general. And very important thing that there's need to work and plan realistically around funding and limited budgets. And I would say this is a primary constraint that you have to work with, but also understanding what's the minimal budgets that makes this product to reach next milestone, not trying to compromise things that cannot be done properly according to industry practices, for example. So we can talk about later maybe in more details. And some of it will be specific to product development, component stage, sector and business model too. So the specifics of projects will be really different if you develop a consumer product versus low volume manufactured business to business robot, for example. It's very different metrics and very different manufacturing even strategies when it comes to, do you manufacture in-house, do you use contract manufacturer, how much customizations we can do, how much we can change once we go through the new product introduction process, and so on and so on. Yeah, and more and more, which we can talk about in Q&A session. Yeah, and I think that this is pretty much the presentation, the short story, and in some arbitrary way presented. One thing which I wanted to just share before we go to Q&A, that me with two other friends of mine, Joanna Forish and Marta Zucker, were working on a popular science book called Robotization and the Era of Creative People, which I highly encourage you to follow once we'll be in stage to publish it, actually. So this is an ongoing project, which we'll be talking about later, maybe publicly on LinkedIn and other sources. Thank you so much. I will stop sharing. Now you can reach me on this email address on LinkedIn or on my website, @tomaszwierzchowski.com. And I will hand back to, I guess, Radhika for the next Q&A session.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for very interesting presentation. I think there are a couple of questions in the chat, and all of us, we have our own burning questions about entrepreneurship. Probably we'll ask away. I would request Jeff, Oliver, or almost we are limited number of participants, so feel free to unmute yourself and switch on your videos so that we can see each other, and then we can, thank you. So there is one question. I'll go by the order. So let me, Oliver, his question. Do you want to ask away, Oliver, or do you want?
Oh,
no. Yeah.
You do it.
Okay. Do you have a suggestion for how to evaluate different startup ideas against each other, or to decide which one of the multiple ideas for a startup that might be best to pursue?
Maybe one question, Oliver, to clarify. Are you now talking about which perspective? Is this as
a potential founder, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see. So I have, I guess, a bit radical approach to this. So I'm coming from engineering background, and that's where most of the entrepreneurs like robotics entrepreneurs will go from. But I learned quite a lot how much a business perspective is actually more important. I mean, both of them, you cannot have just one, but the business is as important, even more important than the technology one. So first thing is, what's the business case? Even if we have some technologies that we want to find the business use case, it might be that there's no good business case for a specific technology. So the first metrics I would use is maybe thinking about a business problem or a product before trying to choose technology, which can become hard. And I don't think so. There is an kind of a process to this, like structured. So it also, I think, depends on where the potential entrepreneur comes from. Like typically it's a researcher or someone who worked in corporate and has experience in specific set of technologies, maybe in driving robots, maybe in perception, right? Maybe localization systems. So it's, I mean, this one of the successful like examples I've seen. If you are good at something, probably it's good that you pursue this, and to use this. So if you are good at, let's say, localization, perception, in control, try to leverage it, but then either try to see if you can make a kind of subsystem product. So, and let's say if you're good at SLAM, maybe you should think about creating some licensable SLAM system, although first do research, because maybe there's so many of them, people who've done it for 10 years, which will be difficult to compete with. So there's one part, and another part is to actually develop a full stack, or let's say part stack, but a product which is actually something which you're not licensing to other robotics or technology companies, but it will serve a purpose, which is very different ball game. Not saying it's more difficult, but it's bigger, definitely, because and potentially more profitable as well.
So essentially having a use case or a business case for whatever you're developing, whether you can license it or whether you can launch it as a product or a software stack. So essentially that should be the motivator. So the business case should be the motivator.
Yes, yeah, and now we can go further, but like I think this is the basics, and of course the technology maturity. Like, do I understand that I can make a product out of this, which will work for 10, 100, 1,000 customers?
Yeah. So there are a few more questions coming in the chat. As I can see, some are based on your own presentation, where the places where you worked or the things that you created. So maybe let's pick up the one which is about aerialtronics. So the question is about how did you first join aerialtronics? Is it like as an employee, and what made you transition to a different place?
Absolutely. Okay, so I'll try to make it concise. Six questions. So how did you start cooperation with electronics? Yes, so I did see a job offer on LinkedIn, but it was not a job offer as a paranormal. It was in a group. So it was, LinkedIn used to have a groups back in 2012, and that was in embedded systems, I think, group. So not typically drones group, because there were not many drones then that time. Yeah, and I pretty much pursued then this advert, and I was invited, flew over for interview, and then given an offer. So yeah, that's the first question. Second one is, it was your first job? No, so I had a few internships before. I also worked in corporate for a while, not too long. So not my first job, but first, which I stayed for a long time, yes. Biggest challenges in developing drones. So that's well, it has to fly, and yeah, that's it has to fly with something
the
useful.
primary thing.
Yeah, then that's kind
like
of
a human has to walk. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. But like, I mean, you can argue, yes, with walking is, but like safety aspects and reliability, because like if it stops flying, it will drop down. So and it's aerodynamics involved, plus weight challenge, because of flying, weight challenge. So integration and safety and so on and so on. So, and again, I know Tomasz, so Tomasz is also experienced with drones. So many challenges, but and the controls as well, especially if it's not a stable platform like multirotors are. So okay, why did you leave electronics? Of course, if you would like to say, I think at some stage you want to move on for various reasons. That's why I leave it there for now.
Yeah. So I mean, I have one question on. I was following the ABC during your presentation. While it looks more like agri-tech kind of technology. You were mentioning that you received funding from space agencies like ESA BIC and UK Space Tech, etc. So what's the connection between the space technology and the ABC technology with the agri-tech?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the business in very kind of short helicopter picture was always developed with agriculture in mind. So this was like this other way of, like what I explained to Oliver question, other angle. First, what's the problem? And the founder of the company had farming background as well as aerospace. So he knew that there's place for, let's say, drones or robotics in agriculture. but he hasn't assumed anything. So first found a big enough problem and then came up with hopping drone, okay? So this is the history, the background. And of course, as you progress, then you might think more, okay, if we have more time, more funding, and we are bored, let's say, or can we do something in parallel or in spin-off in future? So that's where other applications come in. Space, what I can say, one obvious thing, hopping from kind of humankind experience on bodies with the lower gravity than Earth works quite efficient when it comes to locomotion. And sometimes you don't have atmosphere. So, which means that flying doesn't really work, even on Mars when there's atmosphere, but with very low density, right? You see even this Perseverance helicopter, sorry, Ingenuity helicopter now on Mars drone. It requires extremely large blades compared to its size and still has kind of a very limited range. So hopping is very natural locomotion mode for something on other planets, especially for mapping missions, for example. So, or Scout. Yeah, that's, but yeah, that's as far as I can say. Yeah.
So continuing on the ABC theme, Carol asked that you said the company was founded in 2016 and received the first significant funding in 2018. So what is it that the company has been doing in those 2 years? Did you self-fund yourself, or what actually happened? Background in the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. So small disclaimer. So I haven't founded ABC myself. I joined after 2-3 years of when company was founded. So I will tell the story of Fred Miller, who is the original founder. So he decided to start the company because he wanted to do something of significant importance, and he's a product person with aerospace background and farming family. So 3 things came together. Now, what happened between 2016 and 2018? So actually fundraising is very, very challenging, especially if you, whatever you fundraise for, like in startup world, especially the first round and second round. So this was actually fundraising, but also building the business model, talking to potential customers, to experts, to agronomists, and starting to pitch. This is pretty much building a vision of a company product from scratch. And pitching, I think, started after a year of this type of business model development, product creation, maybe some prototyping, but this will not go into a product development unless you do an app, like a mobile phone app. You cannot really prototype unless you are at university, you're academic, you can share, infrastructure, or you're very rich, so you've self-founded. But I mean, in robotics, you either do things properly or not, I would say, with some kind of gray. Yeah, this is kind of another, I think, something that should be taught at the universities, or I don't know, maybe in this type of workshops that yeah, you need to, of course, you shouldn't do like the extreme processes and then to fundraise, $10 million US dollars at the first round, but people need to be aware of entrepreneurs that different tools for different stages. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can absolutely support what you said. Myself being in some of the investor networks where I see the founders literally have to go through quite a lot, answer so many questions, so many one-to-one meetings with angels and other VCs before they actually fundraise. I think there was a saying that I came across: you need to kiss a lot of frogs before you actually find your prince. So yeah, absolutely. And it's a tough journey, but the rewards end of it are usually the fruits when the tree bears are quite tasty and enjoyable. So question from Jeff. So he's saying, the consumer facing and in ABC, which is a business facing company, what do you say would be the main differences?
Right. Yes. So with consumer, I'll start with consumer facing. So with consumer facing, you don't meet consumer pretty much. You don't work with, of course, you need to understand him and you can get a sample of your consumer, but consumer is a mass. So this is a product that you, as I kind of hinted, you develop one, let's say, first generation of a product, first model, and once it goes through mass production, so once you close the new NPI process, it's done. Of course, you can do some software updates, but as all of you know, you cannot fix everything in software, although like many executives would like to do this. So what does it mean? That you need to think about quite a lot upfront, and also you're developing for normally low cost, which means that you need to compromise on, have a trade-off between the sensor suite, computation power, and all of the challenges of manufacturing as well, product at scale, which means that it requires more careful strategic planning, which you cannot take any shortcuts pretty much. Of course, startup can be more efficient than corporate, so can do things, I won't say faster, but comparable timelines. Maybe a bit shorter, but definitely you cannot deliver a product from concept to market in 6 months or a year in consumer space. And we're talking about volumes here. So yes, and in general, consumer robotics is tough because consumers, they don't care that we are developing interesting robotics technology. It either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, it's an 2-star or 1-star Amazon review, pretty much. And that's as simple as this. And people don't care. It's like an evolving technology. It needs to be intuitive, and it needs to be autonomous. Well, this is challenging. As we know, there will be always use cases where the algorithms will not work. Yes. So this is.
When we talk about consumers, I keep coming across this concept of early adopters and then people who take it up later, and then the laggards in the end. So when it comes to the consumer facing products, would it work going that way? So identify your early adopters and only offer it to them and then move on to offering it to wider community. Is that an approach? Or
I think it's idealistic approach a bit. So it depends how much. Okay, so main thing with consumer, like, and it's about a scale of how many units you manufacture. So if you have an luxury of having enough budgets to do enough early adopters, which you will actually pay quite a lot for these prototypes or for early manufacturing, this will de-risk significantly. But then you still have to go through the full manufacturing process after that. And this will be your real customers, because early adopters, and it's maybe different if you're if you're a well-known brand, you know, as Dyson maybe, or some others, because it's different game. But if you don't have a brand yet, as a startup by default, whatever you do, you have to be very careful. You can leverage more, you can be more kind of agile, but in the end, these early adopters can even give you a bit false feedback, and some problems will only happen at scale, right? So you take, let's say, 100 early adopters on some crowdfunding platform, which they will love whatever you deliver pretty much if it works, right? But then you do a second run, and then you go into full manufacturing, and then you find out actually real customers' feedback. So I think it's these early adopters come from software world, which iterations and the costs of iteration and time is very different. So I think it requires a bit different approach to user, and depends how much, I guess, novelty is there and how unique your good product is. So yeah, this is kind of nutshell.
Yeah. I think we are nearly coming to a close. So I have a couple of last two questions before we get to the closure. Both of them are slightly related. So the first thing is when you come from a technology background, usually as a roboticist or a robotics engineer, there are so many jobs out there where you can be paid quite a lot. So what made you choose this journey of working with startups and going through all these hiccups and tough journeys of launching that startup and that product? That's the first question. And the last one would be, what are your plans as an entrepreneur moving forward?
Absolutely. So I think on the slide when I explained kind of highlights of a startup, startups work in modern robotics, one of the points was touching on influence on a product. So the majority of difference when you work at a bigger team, especially at early of your career, is that on one side you can potentially learn quite a lot of processes and so on. On the other side, probably we'll be working on like not really next generation of technology. I'm not talking about using specific, let's say, tools, but I'm talking about the type of product robot, because that's how normal innovation cycle works. The innovations come from startups or spin-offs, not from corporates, with some exemptions. And in startups, you will be on the forefront. And I think and you have bigger influence, and if the team is experienced enough, you will learn much more than at this well-paid. Especially, I think the more well-paid job is in general, the less interesting it gets. In robotics, I can tell you this is pretty much how it goes. Or the more, let's say, in worst stage is the project. Like with autonomous vehicles currently, cars I'm specifically speaking about. Yes, so yeah, I think in general, I don't think so there's also that much of difference gap in pay in general in robotics. It's kind of democratized, I would say, more or less nowadays. Yeah, and I would say it's good to learn, and that's why I joined Dyson at some stage to learn from someone who's doing it for 16 years. Kind of silently, and in stealth mode. But then back into startups, and that's what I enjoy. I think quite a lot. But I also enjoy working with corporates which are starting or scaling their programs, because that's where you can still have impact actually. Because it's different if you go to a business which is doing the mobile robotics for 10 years already. And unless they do something very different, so they start walking robots, for example, maybe you need like some very different approach. But I think having influence on the processes and the strategy is something that I personally, at my stage, enjoy, because I know how much it can help and how much pain points if you, together with a team, come up with maybe a bit different way of working on, especially where you can apply something like systems engineering practices, requirements analysis, modeling, model-based designs, and so on. Things that I've seen in few teams which worked very well. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Thanks, Thomas. So thanks so much for joining in, taking your time from your busy schedule to, this is the first in the series. So we are trying to promote as much as possible. So the turnout is definitely not as much as we expected, but we are trying to encourage people and trying to build that database so that young entrepreneurs will take advantage from more experienced, successful entrepreneurs like you. We'll try to circulate the recording to various places where they might benefit from listening to your talk and your journey and the answers.